I still remember the exact moment my life divided into before and after. The moment I stopped being a wife and slowly became a stranger inside my own home. And even now, as I sit here telling my story as a widow, I sometimes wonder if everything that followed could have been avoided if I had chosen silence instead of revenge, patience instead of pride. But back then, I was not the woman I am today. Back then, I was still Margaret Maggie Lawson, a woman who believed in love with a kind of quiet certainty. And my husband, Ethan Lawson, was the center of that belief. The man I trusted with every fragile piece of my heart. The man I thought would grow old with me. The man I believed would never betray me in a way that would destroy everything we had built together. And for years our life had been simple, not perfect but warm and steady, filled with small routines that made everything feel safe. Like Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch, or the way he used to call my name from the kitchen just to ask if I wanted tea. And maybe that is why it took me so long to see the truth. Because when you believe in someone that deeply, your mind protects you from doubt. It wraps reality in comfort and tells you everything is fine even when it is slowly falling apart. And so when the first signs appeared, I ignored them. I explained them away. I told myself I was overthinking. Because the alternative was too painful to accept, and it started quietly, almost invisibly. The late nights at work that became more frequent. The calls he would take in another room. The sudden attention to his appearance as if he had someone new to impress. And I remember the first night it truly unsettled me. When he came home well past midnight, and I was sitting in the living room with the lights dim, waiting like I always did. And when he walked past me, there was a scent on him that didn't belong to me. Something soft and unfamiliar that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. And when I asked him why he was late, he barely looked at me. He just muttered something about work and loosened his tie as if my question didn't matter. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, something small but permanent, because it wasn't just the excuse. It was the absence of care in his voice. The absence of the man I thought I knew. And from that night on, I began to notice everything. The way he smiled at his phone as if it held a secret. The way he turned the screen away when I entered the room. The way his laughter felt distant, like it belonged to another life that I was no longer part of. And I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I was afraid of them, afraid that once the truth was spoken out loud, there would be no way to undo it. No way to go back to the version of us I was desperately trying to hold on to. So instead I watched and I waited. And the silence between us grew heavier with each passing day, stretching across weeks and then months until it felt like we were living separate lives under the same roof. And then one afternoon everything changed, because that was the day Ethan forgot his phone at home. And it sat there on the kitchen counter lighting up again and again with messages that I tried so hard to ignore. I remember standing there telling myself to walk away, telling myself that trust meant not looking, that love meant believing without proof. But deep down I already knew. I just didn't want confirmation, because confirmation would mean the end of denial and the beginning of something far more painful. But in the end, curiosity and fear and heartbreak became too heavy to carry all at once, and my hand moved before I could stop it, and I picked up his phone. And the moment the screen lit up, my world shattered in the quietest, most devastating way, because the message staring back at me was not just a sentence. It was proof of everything I had been trying not to believe, and it said, "I miss last night already," and my hands began to tremble as if my body understood the truth before my mind could accept it. And somehow I unlocked the phone and found myself reading through a life that did not include me. Message after message filled with intimacy and laughter and plans that used to belong to us. And her name was Chloe Bennett, a name that burned itself into my memory in a way I could never erase. And what hurt the most was not just the betrayal but the happiness in his words. The way he spoke to her with a warmth he had not shown me in years. The way he seemed alive again in a way I had not seen in so long. And in that moment, I realized I had not just lost his loyalty. I had lost his love long before I even knew it was gone, and that realization broke something deep inside me in a way I cannot fully explain, because I did not cry the way I thought I would. I did not scream or collapse. Instead, I became very still, very quiet, as if all the emotion had been drained out of me and replaced with something colder, something sharper, something that did not feel like heartbreak, but like the beginning of something far more dangerous. And as I stood there in that silence, one thought began to form slowly and steadily, growing stronger with every breath I took. And it was not a thought of forgiveness or understanding. It was a thought of justice, or at least what I believed justice to be in that moment. Because somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered that he deserved to feel the same pain he had given me, that he deserved to experience the kind of betrayal that leaves you hollow and questioning everything. And I placed the phone back exactly where it had been, carefully and deliberately, as if nothing had happened. And when Ethan came home that evening, I greeted him with the same gentle smile I had always worn. I asked about his day. I served him dinner. I played the role of the loving wife so perfectly that even I almost believed it. But inside I was no longer the same woman. Inside something had shifted beyond repair. And that night, as he slept peacefully beside me, unaware of the storm growing within me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my eyes dry. My heart strangely calm, and in that calmness a plan began to take shape, not all at once but in fragments, in quiet, dangerous thoughts that slowly connected into something real, something irreversible. And at the time I believed that plan would give me closure, that it would give me power, that it would restore some sense of balance to a world that had suddenly become unbearably unfair. But what I did not know, what I could not possibly understand in that moment, was that the path I was about to choose would not just destroy him, it would destroy me too, and that the consequences of my actions would follow me long after the betrayal itself had faded into memory, shaping the woman I would eventually become, the widow who now sits here telling you this story, wishing with every part of her soul that she had chosen differently when she still had the chance. The strange thing about discovering betrayal is that the world does not stop. The sun still rises, the coffee still brews, the clock still ticks with the same steady rhythm, and yet inside you something fundamental has shifted, something that makes every ordinary moment feel unreal. And that is exactly how I lived the days after I found those messages on Ethan's phone, moving through life like an actress playing a role she no longer believed in, smiling when I was supposed to smile, speaking when I was expected to speak, all while carrying a truth so heavy it felt like it might crush me if I let it surface even for a second. And Ethan never suspected a thing. He moved around me with the same careless ease, unaware that I now saw everything, that every glance, every late-night message, every distracted answer was no longer hidden behind trust. And instead of confronting him, instead of demanding answers the way any reasonable wife might have done, I chose silence. Because silence gave me something I had already begun to crave, control, and control felt safer than vulnerability. It felt stronger than heartbreak. And so I watched him more carefully than ever before, studying his habits, his routines, the patterns he didn't even realize he had created. I noticed how he always checked his phone first thing in the morning with a faint smile he tried to hide, how he lingered longer at work on certain days of the week, how he became oddly protective of his privacy in ways he never had before. And piece by piece, the truth of his double life revealed itself to me, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet confirmations that left no room for doubt. And each confirmation didn't break me further. Instead, it hardened something inside me. It replaced pain with a cold, focused clarity that I barely recognized in myself. And I began to think not as a wife, not as a victim, but as someone preparing for something deliberate, something calculated. And I told myself it wasn't revenge. I told myself it was justice, that I was simply restoring balance. But deep down I knew that what I was feeling was far darker than that. And still I continued, because once you step onto that path, it becomes very difficult to turn back. And one evening, as I sat alone in the living room while Ethan showered upstairs, his phone buzzed again on the table beside me, and this time I didn't hesitate. This time I picked it up without guilt, without fear, as if I had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And the message was from Chloe, her words light and playful, asking if he would see her the next day, and I felt a strange calm wash over me as I read it. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of certainty, because now I knew when and where he would be, and that knowledge felt powerful in a way that scared me even as it steadied me. And that night, for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what it would mean to make him feel what I had felt, to take away his sense of control, to force him into a moment where he would have to face the consequences of his choices. And the thought didn't horrify me the way it should have. Instead, it lingered, growing stronger, more detailed, more real, until it began to shape itself into a plan, not a vague idea but something tangible, something I could actually carry out. And over the next few days, that plan took form slowly and carefully. I paid attention to every detail of his routine, every opportunity, every moment when he would be vulnerable and unaware. And I began to prepare in small, almost invisible ways, ways that would not raise suspicion, ways that would allow me to remain the same quiet, devoted wife he believed me to be. And all the while I continued to play my role perfectly. I cooked his meals. I asked about his work. I laughed at the right moments. And sometimes I even caught him looking at me with a flicker of guilt in his eyes, as if some part of him knew he was doing something wrong, but not enough to stop, never enough to choose me. And that realization only strengthened my resolve, because if he could live a lie so easily, then I could create one just as convincing. And one night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table in a silence that felt heavier than ever, he mentioned casually that he would be working late again the next evening. And I nodded as if it meant nothing, as if I hadn't already read the message confirming his plans with her. And in that moment, something inside me settled completely, because everything was aligning, everything was falling into place, and I knew that the time for watching and waiting was coming to an end. And as I lay in bed that night beside him, listening to his steady breathing, I realized that I was no longer hesitating. I was no longer questioning whether I should go through with it. I had already decided, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself out loud, and the plan that had once been just a whisper in the back of my mind had now become something real, something inevitable, and I told myself again that he deserved it, that he had brought this upon himself, that I was simply giving him a taste of his own betrayal. But somewhere deep inside, beneath all the anger and the hurt and the determination, there was a small, quiet part of me that was afraid, not of him. Not of what he had done, but of what I was becoming, and I ignored that voice just as I had ignored all the others before it, because by then I was too far gone, too consumed by the need to act, to prove to myself that I was not weak, that I would not be the woman who simply accepted betrayal and moved on. And so I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me, knowing that the next day would set everything into motion, knowing that by this time tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same again. The next day arrived with a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that settles before something irreversible happens, and I woke up earlier than usual, lying in bed beside Ethan as he slept peacefully, his face calm in a way that almost made him look like the man I had once fallen in love with. And for a brief moment I felt something fragile stir inside me, something that almost resembled hesitation. But it didn't last, because the memory of those messages, of his laughter with Chloe, of the life he was building behind my back, came rushing in and hardened my resolve once again, and I slipped out of bed quietly, moving through the house with a sense of purpose that felt both unfamiliar and frighteningly natural, as if some part of me had been waiting for this moment all along. And the morning passed like any other on the surface. I made breakfast. I spoke to him gently. I watched him get ready for work with the same careful attention I had given him for years. And when he kissed my cheek before leaving, a habit he had never quite abandoned, I forced myself not to react, not to pull away, not to show even the smallest crack in the mask I had perfected. Because by then I understood something clearly. The more normal I appeared, the less he would suspect, and suspicion was the one thing that could ruin everything I had been preparing for. And once he left the house, I stood there in the silence he had left behind, feeling my heart pound in a way that made it difficult to breathe, not from doubt but from the weight of what I was about to do. And I moved through the day methodically, checking and rechecking every detail of my plan, making sure there would be no mistakes, no loose ends, no chance of things slipping out of my control. And as the hours passed, the nervous energy inside me transformed into something sharper, more focused, until I felt almost detached from myself. Like I was watching someone else carry out these actions, someone colder, someone capable of things I had never imagined before. And by the time evening approached, I knew there was no turning back, not anymore. And when Ethan called to tell me he would be working late, his voice casual, almost careless, I responded the same way I always did, with understanding, with softness, with a lie that matched his own. And after the call ended, I stood there for a long moment holding the phone, feeling the final piece of certainty settle into place, because now I knew exactly where he would be and exactly what he would be doing. And instead of breaking me, that knowledge fueled me. It pushed me forward, and I began to put the final part of my plan into motion, my hands steady despite everything, my movements precise. And I remember pausing for just a second, staring at what I had done, realizing how far I had come from the woman I used to be, the woman who would have cried, who would have begged for answers, who would have chosen love over anger. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered what she would think of me now. But that thought disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the overwhelming need to see this through, to finish what I had started. And when everything was ready, I stepped back and looked around the house. The same house that had once felt like a place of comfort and now felt like a stage set for something far darker. And time seemed to slow as I waited. Every second stretching longer than the last, my mind racing with possibilities, with outcomes I could not fully predict. And yet I told myself it would be simple, that it would go exactly as planned, that I was in control. And as the evening turned into night, I felt a strange calm settle over me again, the same calm I had felt the night I first discovered his betrayal. And I understood then that this was no longer just about him. It was about me, about proving something to myself, about reclaiming a sense of power I had lost without even realizing it. And when I finally heard the faint sound that told me Ethan had returned home, my heart began to beat faster, not with fear but with anticipation, because this was it, the moment everything would change. And I positioned myself exactly where I needed to be, my expression carefully neutral, my breathing steady. And when he walked through the door, tired and unaware, calling out my name in that familiar voice that once brought me comfort, I answered him just as I always did, my tone calm, my words simple, giving him no reason to suspect that anything was different, no reason to believe that the woman standing before him was no longer the wife he thought he knew. And as he moved through the house, following the same routine he had followed 100 times before, I watched him with a quiet intensity, knowing that in just a matter of moments, the illusion he had been living in would shatter, and that he would finally face something he could not ignore, something he could not escape. And as the final seconds passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity, I realized that there was no fear left inside me, no doubt, no hesitation, only a single, unshakable certainty that I had already crossed a line I could never return from, and whatever happened next would not just change his life, it would change mine forever. Everything happened faster than I had imagined, yet in my memory it stretches out into slow, unbearable moments that replay over and over again, as if time itself refused to move forward without forcing me to witness every second of what I had done. And I remember standing there, my body tense but my face calm, as Ethan moved through the house exactly as I knew he would, setting his keys down, loosening his tie, calling out to me in that casual, familiar tone that once made me feel safe. And for a brief second I almost faltered, almost called out his name with honesty instead of deception, almost stopped everything before it began. But that moment passed like a flicker of light in darkness, replaced again by the cold determination that had carried me this far, and I watched him disappear into the bedroom, following the routine he never questioned, never examined, because why would he? This was his home, his space, a place where he believed he was in control, and I remained where I was, my hands trembling slightly now despite all my effort to stay steady, because even though I had planned this, even though I had convinced myself it was necessary, there was still a part of me that understood I was about to unleash something I could not fully contain. And then it began, not with a dramatic explosion or a sudden crash, but with confusion, with his voice calling out my name again, this time uncertain, questioning, and I felt my heart pound against my chest as I stood frozen, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. And his voice came again, sharper now, laced with irritation, with something close to alarm, and I took a step forward before I could stop myself, drawn toward the sound despite knowing exactly what I would find. And when I reached the doorway, the scene in front of me felt both expected and unreal at the same time, like something I had imagined so many times that it no longer felt like reality. And for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stand there as everything unfolded exactly as I had set it in motion. And Ethan turned toward me, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to frustration to something closer to panic. And he demanded to know what was going on, his voice rising in a way I had rarely heard before. And I remember opening my mouth as if to answer, but no words came out, because suddenly the reality of the situation pressed down on me with a weight I had not anticipated. And what I had thought would feel like satisfaction, like justice, instead felt chaotic, unpredictable, slipping beyond the boundaries of my control. And the more he struggled, the more his frustration grew, the more the situation escalated in ways I had not fully considered, and I could see it in his eyes now. The realization that something was very wrong, that this was not a simple mistake, not something he could fix on his own, and he looked at me again. This time not with anger, but with a kind of desperate confusion, as if he was searching my face for answers, for understanding, for the woman he believed I still was. And in that moment, something inside me cracked, because for the first time since I had discovered his betrayal, I saw not the man who had hurt me, but the man I had once loved, vulnerable and uncertain, and looking at me as if I could make everything okay. And I felt a surge of emotion rise up, something tangled and overwhelming. Part anger, part regret, part something I couldn't even name, and I realized then that this was not going to end the way I had imagined. This was not a clean moment of revenge where he would simply understand my pain and I would walk away feeling stronger. This was messy and frightening and spiraling out of control, and the more I tried to steady myself, the more I felt that control slipping away, and his voice grew louder, more urgent, calling my name again and again, asking what I had done, demanding that I fix it. And I stood there caught between two versions of myself, the woman who had planned this and the woman who now wanted to undo it, who wanted to step forward and stop everything before it went any further. But it was already too late, because the situation had reached a point where neither of us could handle it alone. And I saw the moment it dawned on him, the moment he realized that we would need help, that this was no longer something we could hide within the walls of our home. And panic flickered across his face in a way that made my stomach twist, because now the consequences were no longer just between us. Now the outside world would see, would know. And as that realization settled in, the weight of what I had done came crashing down on me all at once, heavier than anything I had felt before, and I wanted to take it back, to rewind time to the moment before I picked up his phone, before I let anger guide my actions. But time does not move backward. It only pushes forward, dragging you along with it whether you are ready or not. And as the next moments unfolded, filled with urgency and rising chaos, I understood with terrifying clarity that this was no longer just a lesson for him. This was the beginning of something far more serious, something that would leave marks on both of us in ways neither of us could yet understand. And as I stood there, watching everything unravel, I realized that the plan I had believed would give me closure had instead opened a door I could never close again, a door that would lead me down a path I had never intended to walk. And in that moment, for the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to fear settle deep inside me, because I no longer knew how this would end, and that uncertainty was far more terrifying than anything I had imagined when I first decided to seek my revenge. The moment the decision was made to call for help, everything shifted from something private and contained into something exposed and uncontrollable. And I remember standing there as Ethan reached for his phone with shaking hands. His movements rushed and unsteady in a way I had never seen before. And for a brief second I thought about stopping him, about telling him not to make that call, not to let anyone else see what had happened inside our home. But the truth was we had already passed the point where pride or secrecy mattered, because what was happening was no longer something we could handle on our own. And as he spoke hurriedly into the phone, trying to explain a situation that even he could barely comprehend, I felt a cold wave of reality wash over me. Because this was it. This was the consequence I had not fully allowed myself to imagine. Strangers entering our space, witnessing the aftermath of my actions, turning what I had intended as a private act of revenge into something public and undeniable. And the minutes that followed felt endless, stretching out with a heavy silence broken only by Ethan's frustrated, anxious voice and the sound of movement that only made everything worse. And I stayed where I was, unable to fully step forward but also unable to walk away, trapped in the space between action and regret, watching as the situation grew more urgent with every passing second. And when the distant sound of sirens finally reached my ears, my heart sank in a way that made it hard to breathe, because that sound carried with it a finality I could not escape. It meant that what had happened was no longer just between us. It meant that everything would soon be seen, questioned, and remembered. And I wrapped my arms around myself as if trying to hold together the pieces of a reality that was slipping further and further out of my control. And Ethan looked at me again, his expression now a mixture of anger and desperation, as if he could not decide whether to blame me or beg me to fix what I had done. And that look stayed with me, cutting deeper than I expected, because it reminded me that no matter what he had done to me, no matter how deeply he had betrayed me, I had now become the one responsible for this moment, for this chaos, for this irreversible step beyond the boundaries of our broken marriage. And when the knock finally came at the door, firm and urgent, it felt like a judgment I could not avoid, and Ethan called out for them to come in, his voice strained and tense, and within seconds they were inside, their presence filling the house with a kind of authority and urgency that made everything feel even more real, even more overwhelming. And I stepped back instinctively, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, as they moved quickly to assess the situation. Speaking in calm but focused tones that contrasted sharply with the panic that had taken over the room, and I watched them, barely able to process what was happening. As they worked to handle something that should never have happened in the first place, something that existed only because of the choices I had made, and time seemed to blur again, moments slipping into each other as instructions were given, movements were made, and the situation was slowly brought under control. But even as things began to stabilize, the emotional weight of it all pressed down on me harder than ever, because now there was no denying it, no minimizing it. No pretending it was something small or insignificant. This was real, this had happened, and I was the reason why. And as I stood there in the corner of the room, feeling more like an outsider than a part of the scene unfolding in front of me, I realized that whatever sense of power I had hoped to gain from this had completely vanished, replaced instead by a deep, sinking awareness of how far things had gone. And Ethan avoided looking at me now, his focus entirely on what was happening. On getting through this moment, and that distance between us felt different than before, heavier, more final, as if something had been broken in a way that could never be repaired. And when everything was finally resolved, when the immediate urgency had passed and the room fell into a quieter, strained stillness, I felt an emptiness settle inside me that I could not escape, because there was no relief, no satisfaction, no sense of justice, only the echo of a decision I could not take back. And the growing realization that this moment, this night, would not just fade away with time, it would stay with us, shaping everything that came after in ways I could not yet fully understand. And as the last traces of chaos began to fade, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides, I understood with painful clarity that I had not just changed the course of our marriage, I had changed the course of my own life, and whatever came next would be built on the ruins of what I had done. A reality I would have to face whether I was ready or not. In the quiet that followed, after the strangers had gone and Ethan retreated to the bedroom, the house felt impossibly large and empty, every corner echoing with the tension of what had just occurred, and I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the surfaces as if grounding myself in the familiar, in what had once been a home, but nothing felt the same anymore. Nothing carried the warmth it once had, and I realized with a shiver that nothing ever would, because in that night, in those irreversible moments, we had crossed a line from which there was no return. I tried to sit, tried to breathe, tried to tell myself that what I had done was justified, that he had betrayed me and this was merely a reckoning. But the words felt hollow in my mouth, a fragile defense against the reality that now pressed in on me from all sides. And I remembered every small detail leading up to this, every ignored sign, every late night, every secret message, every flicker of doubt I had pushed aside, and I saw now how carefully I had walked the path that led us here. Convinced that control would keep the chaos at bay, and yet control had been a mirage, slipping through my fingers the moment I reached for it. Ethan did not speak when he finally emerged from the bedroom hours later, his face pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding mine, and I could see the weight of shame and fear pressing down on him as heavily as it pressed down on me. And for a brief, fleeting moment, I almost felt pity, almost wanted to reach out and soothe the storm inside him, to remind myself of the man I had once loved, the man who had made promises, held me, laughed with me, whispered forever in a way that had once sounded so certain. But that moment dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving only the cold certainty that nothing could go back to what it had been, that the trust we had lost, the walls we had built around ourselves, could never be reconstructed. We did not speak of the night's events, and in the silence, a strange routine emerged, one that neither of us admitted aloud but that shaped every interaction, every glance, every word spoken in careful moderation. And I began to notice things in him I had never seen before, small tremors in his hands when he reached for a glass of water, the tightness in his jaw when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he flinched at sounds that hadn't mattered before, and it terrified me. Because I realized that my actions had not only unsettled him, they had fundamentally changed him, and perhaps more frighteningly, they had changed me too. This quiet, watchful, calculating version of myself that had emerged in the shadows of betrayal. The version who could sit beside a man she loved and plot a course for his humiliation without hesitation. Days turned into weeks, but the atmosphere in our home remained taut, fragile, like a thread stretched to its limit. And I discovered in those weeks that revenge, once enacted, does not bring satisfaction. It only leaves space for new fears, new anxieties, new reflections on choices that cannot be undone. And sometimes at night I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible consequence of that night, every way in which our lives could unravel further, every friend, every neighbor, every stranger who might somehow discover what had occurred, and a shiver of helplessness would pass through me, because there was no shield against memory, no barrier to the knowledge of what had been done. And yet, in that tense and quiet period, something unexpected began to happen, a change in myself I could neither ignore nor fully understand, a growing awareness that I had become someone entirely different than the woman who had entered this marriage years ago, someone sharper, more observant, more cautious, someone who would never again allow herself to be blindsided. And though that change gave me a measure of power, it came at a cost, because power without trust, without love, without innocence, is a hollow thing, and I felt the hollowness grow inside me like a shadow, creeping, expanding, unrelenting, and in the quiet hours, when Ethan was asleep, when the house breathed around me in a rhythm I could no longer claim as comforting, I realized that I would have to live with the consequences of my choices every day, for the rest of my life, and that realization was heavier than any anger, any pain, any betrayal had ever been, because it was permanent, undeniable, and entirely mine to bear. I would watch him sometimes, across the room, reading a book, staring out the window, his movements slow and careful, and I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes, the shadow of fear, the way he weighed every word before speaking, and it gave me a strange, twisted satisfaction, tempered immediately by the knowledge that this satisfaction was fleeting, fragile, and that the consequences of this imbalance would continue to grow in ways I could not yet anticipate, and every time I saw it, I reminded myself that I had chosen this, that the pain, the fear, the tension was the product of my own actions, and that understanding brought no relief, only a solemn recognition of responsibility I could never escape. And as I lay awake at night, hearing Ethan's quiet breathing in the bedroom, I realized that this story, this life, was no longer about love or marriage or trust, but about survival, about endurance, about navigating the complex and terrifying terrain that begins when revenge eclipses forgiveness. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the fear and anger and calculated control, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the path I had chosen was long, unpredictable, and full of moments that would test everything I thought I knew about myself. And the woman I had become would be forced to face every single one of them, alone, because there was no turning back. Weeks passed, but the tension in the house never eased. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed to move with purpose, and I found myself walking through each room as though navigating a minefield, careful, precise, calculating, because even the smallest misstep could undo the fragile control I had fought so hard to maintain. Ethan avoided my eyes more and more, and I could feel the distance growing between us with every passing day, a silent chasm built from mistrust, fear, and the memory of that night. And sometimes I would catch him lingering in a room, staring at some point on the floor as if replaying the chaos in his mind. And I knew then that the man I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized, someone wary, cautious, almost haunted. I, too, had changed in ways I could not fully articulate. The woman who had planned revenge and executed it with meticulous precision now lived inside me constantly, alert to every possibility, every angle, every threat to the fragile balance I had created. I found myself thinking about consequences before even allowing myself to feel satisfaction. Each time I watched Ethan flinch at a small noise, I felt a pang of guilt followed immediately by a dark thrill, the twisted duality of emotions I had never imagined I could hold at once. It was intoxicating and terrifying, and I began to wonder if this version of me, the quiet, calculating, observant woman, was who I was meant to be, or if she had been born from the anger and betrayal that had shattered my life. One afternoon, as I was preparing dinner, I overheard Ethan muttering to himself in the living room, fragments of words that betrayed both frustration and fear. "I can't, how did it?" I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply listened, letting his unease feed the strange satisfaction that had begun to intertwine with the lingering guilt. I realized then that revenge was never simple, never clean. It was a living thing, unpredictable, shifting, and with every reaction Ethan had, it grew stronger, feeding on the tension, the fear, the fragility I had instilled. The nights became the hardest part. Lying in bed beside him, hearing his uneven breathing, feeling the space between us widen with every silent hour, I felt a loneliness I had never known. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of living with someone who had once been the center of your world, someone you trusted completely, and realizing that trust had been irrevocably broken, not by chance, but by your own hand as much as theirs. And yet, even in that loneliness, I was alert, watchful, my mind never fully at rest, because I knew the path I had set us on was far from over, and the consequences I had imagined only scratched the surface of what was coming. One night, Ethan woke abruptly, sitting up in bed as if he had been jolted from a dream. His eyes were wide, panic barely concealed. He asked questions, some about the previous events, some that made no sense at all, and I answered carefully, calmly, measuring each word, pretending to be the same wife he had always known, the same Maggie who had made his coffee in the mornings and smiled at his jokes. But underneath, every response was part of the same quiet calculation, a game of maintaining composure while watching him unravel slowly, predictably, as I had planned. I began to notice small cracks forming in his behavior, moments where fear overtook habit, where his attempts at normalcy faltered. I could see him hesitating before opening doors, glancing nervously at places where the incident could have been witnessed, and sometimes he would stumble over his words when speaking to me, as if the memory of that night had lodged itself permanently in his mind, a weight he could not shake. I should have felt remorse at exploiting this fear, but instead, I felt a curious sense of control, a confirmation that my plan, my patience, my careful observation had succeeded in ways I had only imagined. And yet, the deeper I sank into this observation, the more I realized the cost. The woman I had become, the one who thrived in this careful, watchful, calculating vigilance, was no longer just a part of me. She was taking over entirely. The Maggie who had believed in love, who had trusted and laughed and allowed herself to hope, seemed like a distant memory, fading with each passing day. I began to fear that the revenge I had sought so meticulously had not just changed Ethan, had not just unsettled him, but had irrevocably altered me, and perhaps the most frightening realization of all was that I did not want her back. Every day, I repeated the same rituals, checking, watching, waiting, keeping Ethan on edge without overtly revealing my knowledge or intent, and with each success, the strange thrill I felt grew, entwining with a deep undercurrent of fear that I could not name. I had entered a space where satisfaction and regret, power and guilt, coexisted constantly, and I knew that this balance, as fragile as it was, would be my reality from now on. And so I carried on, a widow in waiting, a wife in name only, observing the man I had once loved, controlling the narrative of our lives with a careful hand, knowing that while the world outside might never understand what had happened, the truth inside these walls was undeniable, unrelenting, and permanent, and I understood with a cold clarity that there would be no return to innocence, no reclaiming of trust, no restoration of what had been lost, only the quiet, tense, unending navigation of the consequences I had unleashed. Days blurred into nights, and nights into restless mornings. The house had become a theater of silent tension, every room holding echoes of the chaos we had created. Ethan moved around like a man carrying an invisible weight, cautious in his gestures, careful in his words, and I could see the anxiety in the way he hesitated before opening a cabinet, the way he glanced nervously at doors and windows as though expecting some unseen consequence to appear. I watched him from across the living room, pretending to read a book, but my eyes never left him, tracing every movement, every subtle tremor, every twitch of his jaw, and with each observation, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease, because I realized that my plan, while effective, had changed something fundamental in both of us. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet of our home was no longer comforting. It pressed down on me, heavy and relentless, reminding me of everything that had happened and everything that could still unfold. I would sit at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring my tea, while Ethan moved through the house, speaking less, avoiding me more, and I felt the distance between us grow, a slow widening gap that no apology, no explanation could bridge. I tried to remind myself that this was the consequence of his betrayal, that he had chosen this path, that I was merely delivering the results of his actions, but the truth was more complicated. There were moments when I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost made me cry, and then immediately afterward, a rush of power that left me dizzy, reminding me that I was no longer just a victim. I had become something else entirely. One night, as the house settled into a heavy, uneasy silence, Ethan spoke to me for the first time in days. His voice was low, careful, almost pleading, and he asked if we could talk, really talk, about what had happened, about everything. I looked at him, noting the tremor in his hands, the weariness in his eyes, and for a moment I considered listening, considered allowing a fragment of our past to return through conversation. But I quickly realized that speaking honestly would undo the careful balance I had built. That vulnerability on my part would weaken the position I had so meticulously crafted. And I stayed silent, nodding only faintly, letting him speak while I observed, and the truth struck me then. The power of silence was greater than any words I could offer, and in that silence, I could see him unravel more completely than any confrontation could have achieved. I began to notice new patterns in his behavior, subtle shifts that revealed just how deeply he had internalized the fear and mistrust I had instilled. He double-checked locks, hesitated before picking up his phone, avoided certain rooms for no obvious reason, and sometimes, in the dim light of the evening, I could see him freeze mid-step, as if anticipating some sudden consequence. Each instance confirmed the effectiveness of my plan, yet with every success, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. I was no longer just enacting revenge. I was maintaining a constant, unrelenting control, and that control was exhausting. Sleep became a rare commodity. I lay awake at night, listening to the soft, uneven rhythm of Ethan's breathing, my mind racing through every scenario, every outcome, every ripple effect of what had occurred. I questioned myself constantly. Was this really justice, or had I crossed a line from which there was no return? Was the satisfaction I felt worth the isolation, the tension, the permanent alteration of our lives? I had no answers, only the relentless awareness that the choices I had made were irrevocable, and the life we had once shared was irreparably altered. And yet, even in this state of constant vigilance, a strange sense of clarity emerged. I realized that the woman I had become, calculating, observant, unyielding, was someone I had never known before. She existed because betrayal had demanded her, because anger and grief had forged her in fire. This realization brought a mixture of pride and fear, because while I had gained a measure of control I had never possessed before, I had also lost a part of myself, the version of Maggie who could trust, who could laugh freely, who could love without calculation. Ethan began to retreat further into himself, the lines around his eyes deepening, his voice quieter, his gestures more tentative. I watched him from a distance, knowing that part of him blamed himself, that another part feared me, and yet I could not fully separate the satisfaction from the sorrow, because even though he had betrayed me, even though I had executed my plan perfectly, the emptiness that remained in the aftermath was undeniable. The house was filled with the echoes of that night, the tension of our shared silence, and the unspoken knowledge that everything we had known about each other was gone, replaced by something far darker, far more complex, and irreversible. In those long, heavy hours, I began to understand the true cost of revenge. It was not the satisfaction of seeing justice done, not the fleeting thrill of control. It was the permanent reshaping of lives, the slow erosion of trust, love, and simplicity, the quiet, relentless transformation of both the victim and the perpetrator. I had stepped into a world I could never leave, a world where every glance, every word, every movement carried the weight of what had happened, and I knew that I would never again see Ethan as he once was, nor would he ever see me as the wife he had married. And as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of our new reality pressing down on me, I realized that the path we had walked was only beginning. The ripples of that night would continue to spread, shaping every day, every interaction, every thought, and I understood with absolute clarity that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. We were no longer partners, no longer equals, no longer a family as we had known it. We were two fractured people navigating a life forever altered by betrayal, revenge, and the consequences that followed, and somewhere deep inside, I knew that the story of that night would haunt us both for the rest of our lives. The days that followed became a pattern of unease, a tense rhythm that neither of us could escape. Ethan moved through the house cautiously, always alert, like a man walking through a room he no longer trusted. I watched him from the kitchen table as he brewed his morning coffee, noticing the way his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the mug, the way his eyes darted toward the windows and doors, as if expecting some invisible consequence to emerge. Each movement reminded me of the night that had changed everything, and with every glance, every careful step, I felt the strange mixture of satisfaction and dread that had become my constant companion. Our conversations were minimal, each word carefully measured, as though speaking too freely might shatter the fragile equilibrium we had created. Ethan sometimes tried to breach the silence, asking about the past or reminiscing about moments that once brought us laughter, but I met his attempts with gentle nods, brief words, or silence, understanding that any emotional engagement could unravel the delicate control I had maintained. I had learned that the power of restraint could speak louder than any confession, any argument, any tearful reconciliation. And yet, that restraint came at a cost, a constant tension in my chest, a lingering ache that reminded me every day of the boundary I had crossed and the life I had irreversibly altered. One afternoon, as I sat reading in the living room, Ethan approached me with a hesitant question about the upcoming weekend. His voice was low, careful, almost apologetic, and I noticed the hesitation in his words, the way he seemed to weigh each syllable before speaking. I responded calmly, giving only the necessary details, my tone even, controlled. I could see the relief in his eyes at my composed response, as if he had expected me to erupt in anger or confrontation, and I felt the familiar rush of power and control, tempered by the awareness that this was no longer about satisfaction or revenge. It was about survival, about maintaining the fragile balance that allowed us to coexist under the same roof. Nights remained the hardest. Lying in bed beside him, hearing the uneven rhythm of his breathing, feeling the cold space between us, I often found myself awake for hours, replaying every detail of that night, every choice, every misstep, every consequence. I questioned myself constantly. Had I gone too far? Had I destroyed more than I intended? Had the woman I had become consumed the woman I once was? There were moments when I almost wept, almost longed for the past, for the simplicity of trust and love. But those moments were fleeting, replaced immediately by the awareness that nothing could be undone, that we were trapped in a life shaped by betrayal and retaliation, and that the only way forward was through cautious, deliberate navigation of our new reality. I began to notice subtle changes in Ethan, small but telling shifts that revealed just how deeply the events had affected him. He avoided certain rooms, double-checked locks obsessively, flinched at unexpected noises, and sometimes muttered to himself under his breath, as though replaying the chaos over and over. Each observation reminded me that the revenge I had orchestrated was not a singular moment. It was a living, breathing force that continued to shape our lives daily. And while a part of me felt vindicated, a deeper, quieter part of me recognized the cost. The home we once shared, the trust we had built over years, the love we had nurtured, all gone, replaced by tension, caution, and fear. Friends and family, unaware of the full extent of what had occurred, began to notice subtle changes in our demeanor, our interactions. Casual visits became tense, conversations laced with an unspoken weight, as if the air around us carried the residue of that night. I found myself carefully monitoring every social interaction, every word spoken, every gesture, ensuring that no hint of our private chaos leaked outward. It was exhausting, but I knew that exposure could undo everything I had maintained, could bring the outside world into a situation we were already barely controlling. And yet, amidst the tension and vigilance, I discovered a strange clarity within myself. The woman I had become, the observant, calculating, unflinching woman, was strong in a way I had never anticipated. She existed because betrayal demanded her, because anger and heartbreak forged her, and while that strength carried a weight of isolation and coldness, it also provided a clarity and resilience I could not have accessed before. I realized that this version of me, forged in fire and pain, would have to guide every step moving forward, because the life we now lived left no room for vulnerability, no space for trust, no possibility of returning to what once was. Even now, as I watched Ethan packing quietly in the living room, muttering under his breath, avoiding eye contact, I understood that our marriage, our home, our lives had been permanently reshaped by that single night. There would be no restoration, no forgiveness that could erase the consequences, only careful navigation of a reality that was both familiar and alien, comforting and terrifying. And I knew that the woman I had become would carry the memory of that night, and the power it granted for the rest of her life, whether she liked it or not. The tension in the house had become almost tangible, a constant presence that settled over every corner, every room, every interaction. I could feel it pressing down on me even when I wasn't consciously thinking about it, a reminder of the choices I had made and the irreversible path I had walked. Ethan moved cautiously through the house, his eyes scanning the rooms as if expecting consequences to leap out at him, his gestures measured and precise. There was a quietness in him now, a restraint that was both deliberate and fearful, and it was impossible not to notice. Watching him like this, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Satisfaction that my plan had taken hold, unease at the realization of just how far-reaching its effects were. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his coffee cup as if it held the answers to questions I could never hear. He didn't speak immediately, only lifted the cup to his lips and exhaled slowly, a deep, trembling sigh. I watched him quietly from the counter, stirring my own tea, feeling the weight of the silence between us. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was loaded, filled with the memory of betrayal, of revenge, of fear, and of the knowledge that nothing could ever go back to how it had been. And yet, in that silence, I could see the subtle ways he had changed, the little tells that betrayed the tension coursing through him. Tightened shoulders, clenched jaw, the way his gaze darted toward the windows and doors almost unconsciously. I knew then that our lives had entered a new phase, one defined by caution, calculation, and an uneasy balance that could be disrupted at any moment. Every word, every glance, every movement carried weight. Even when Ethan spoke, asking mundane questions about schedules or errands, I could sense the tension underlying his voice, the hesitation before each syllable, the careful measurement of tone and inflection. And I too had adapted, shaping my own words, my own expressions to maintain control, to keep the balance in place, to ensure that neither of us triggered a spiral of chaos we could no longer contain. At night, the quiet became almost unbearable. Lying in bed, I could hear Ethan's shallow breathing, the subtle creak of the floorboards as he moved, the occasional rustle of sheets as he shifted in restless sleep. My mind replayed the events over and over, examining every detail, every choice, every consequence, wondering if I had done too much, if the power I had sought had come at a price too high to bear. The reality was clear. Revenge had reshaped us both, had changed the fabric of our relationship, and there was no going back. The woman I had been, the trusting, loving Maggie, was gone, replaced by someone sharper, more vigilant, someone who could survive betrayal but could not reclaim innocence. Weeks turned into months, and the pattern of life became a careful dance of observation and restraint. Ethan avoided certain rooms, double-checked locks, and often muttered quietly to himself, replaying events, questioning what could have been different. I watched him, nodding each subtle shift, each reaction, feeling the mix of power and guilt settle heavily in my chest. I was aware that this control was fragile, that one wrong word, one unmeasured action could tip the balance, and yet I couldn't resist the pull of observation, the quiet satisfaction of seeing the consequences unfold, tangible and undeniable. Visitors began to notice subtle changes, though none could have guessed the cause. Our friends commented on the quiet, the distance between us, the way we avoided prolonged eye contact. I smiled politely, deflecting questions, hiding the truth behind a mask of normalcy, knowing that exposure could undo the careful equilibrium I had maintained for so long. Outside the home, the world remained oblivious, but inside, every corner, every glance, every sound carried the memory of that night, a memory that would never fade, a memory that demanded vigilance. And through it all, I discovered something unsettling about myself. The woman who had executed this plan, the woman who had orchestrated revenge with precision, had become someone I barely recognized. She was sharper, more calculating, unyielding, and unafraid to wield control, but she was also isolated, haunted by the weight of what had been done. The duality was constant, strength paired with loneliness, power paired with guilt, and it was exhausting. Yet I realized this was who I had to be to survive, to navigate the consequences of my actions, to face the reality I had created. Ethan, too, was changing in ways I could not have predicted. He had become quieter, more cautious, more haunted by his own actions, and I could see the fear in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted, was now a stranger, a shadow of his former self, shaped by betrayal, by revenge, by the consequences of choices we could never undo. And as I watched him, I realized that we were trapped in a permanent cycle, a delicate, fragile balance between tension and coexistence, and that this balance would define every day, every interaction, every moment of our lives from now on. By now, the house had settled into a rhythm of unease, a fragile tension that seemed almost alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden sound outside, every muted notification on Ethan's phone made my heart rate spike just slightly, a reminder that the events of that night were never far from our reality. I noticed how he now approached daily life with caution, carefully measuring movements that once would have been instinctive. Watching him, I felt a mix of something almost sinister and deeply satisfying, tempered by the undeniable awareness that this control I held was both a shield and a prison for both of us. Our interactions became exercises in restraint. A glance too long, a word too sharp, could undo the delicate balance we had painstakingly built. Ethan avoided eye contact more than ever, and when we spoke, it was always in careful, clipped sentences. I could sense the storm beneath his controlled exterior, the residual panic of that night lurking in the corners of his mind. Sometimes he would fumble with words, pause mid-sentence, as if recalling events that refused to release him, and I would sit silently, observing, noting every subtle detail, every micro-expression, understanding that even the smallest reaction was evidence of the deep, lasting impact of what had occurred. The nights were the most difficult. Sleep had become a luxury I could rarely afford, my mind constantly replaying events, projecting possible outcomes, calculating the next step. I would lie awake listening to Ethan's uneven breathing, aware of every subtle sound, every movement, each one reminding me that nothing could ever go back to what it had been. Occasionally, he would stir in his sleep, muttering fragments of sentences that hinted at regret, fear, or anxiety, and I would remain still, silent, observing, feeling the strange, intoxicating power of watching him wrestle with his own guilt, while knowing I had orchestrated the circumstances. Yet, amid this control, there was an emptiness I could not escape. The satisfaction I had sought in revenge had long since become entangled with guilt, isolation, and the realization that in claiming power, I had lost something essential: trust, innocence, love. Ethan's fear and my vigilance had created a prison for both of us, a cage built from anger, betrayal, and calculated control. And while I had emerged stronger, sharper, more vigilant, I recognized that this strength came with a heavy cost. The woman who had loved freely, laughed without caution, and trusted without calculation was gone, replaced by someone who existed to survive the consequences of her own actions. Friends and family had begun to sense the shift, though none could truly understand it. Invitations were declined, interactions were brief and measured, and a quiet tension seemed to hang around us like a shadow. I would smile politely, nod, deflect inquiries, but inside, I was acutely aware that the events of that night had changed the narrative of our lives permanently. Outside observers could not see the undercurrent of fear and control, but inside, it dictated every movement, every word, every thought. In moments of quiet, I found myself reflecting on the transformation within both of us. Ethan had become cautious, haunted, controlled. I had become observant, calculating, unyielding. We were no longer husband and wife in the traditional sense, nor were we merely cohabitants. We had become something else entirely. Two people bound by the memory of betrayal and the consequences of revenge, trapped in a life neither of us had anticipated, forced to navigate the fragile equilibrium that maintained our coexistence. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the man I had once loved, fleeting moments when his eyes softened, or a gesture reminded me of our past. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the permanent awareness of the night that had changed everything. Each memory, each reflection, reinforced the undeniable truth. Our marriage had been forever altered, and there was no path back to what we had known. We were bound to the consequences of our choices, living in the shadow of that night, forever changed, forever cautious, forever aware that one misstep could unravel the fragile balance we had so painstakingly maintained. And as I watched him moving silently through the house, shoulders tight, hands fidgeting, eyes constantly scanning, I understood with absolute clarity that our lives had been reshaped in ways that could never be undone. The woman I had become, the man he had become, and the life we now shared were all products of a single night, a single act of revenge, and the ripples of that moment would extend indefinitely, shaping every interaction, every thought, every heartbeat. The past was gone. The present was tense, fragile, and unpredictable, and the future, I realized, was entirely uncertain, bound to the consequences of choices that could never be erased. The final months after that night settled into a rhythm that was uneasy, tense, and fragile. Every day began with a careful, measured awareness. Every glance exchanged was weighted with unspoken history, and every word had to be chosen with precision. Ethan moved through the house as though he were navigating a minefield, each step cautious, each gesture deliberate, and I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a flame. Our home, once a place of comfort and laughter, had transformed into a stage of constant vigilance, where fear, guilt, and control dictated the pace of life. Even in the quietest moments, I could sense the unrelenting presence of that night, the indelible mark it had left on both of us, and I understood that nothing could ever wash it away. I, too, had changed profoundly. The woman who had once trusted, laughed freely, and loved without calculation was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, more vigilant, a person forged in betrayal and tempered by revenge. My eyes constantly scanned, my mind always calculating, my emotions carefully modulated to maintain the delicate balance that allowed us to coexist. Power and control had become my tools, but they were double-edged. They gave me authority over the chaos, yet isolated me from the comfort, warmth, and intimacy that had once defined my life. In that realization, there was a strange mix of pride and sorrow, the knowledge that I had survived, but at a cost I could never reverse. Ethan had become a shadow of the man he once was. I could see the constant tension in his posture, the wary glances he cast even when he believed I wasn't looking, the way he muttered quietly to himself in the empty house. The fear that had settled into him was not fleeting. It had taken residence, altering his thoughts, his habits, his very presence. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and guilt, because while part of me relished the control and the evidence of justice served, another part recoiled at the transformation I had imposed, the way his spirit had bent beneath the weight of our shared history. Our conversations were minimal, deliberate, and transactional. Any attempt at warmth or closeness was measured, filtered through the lens of caution and self-preservation. There were no moments of spontaneous laughter, no shared glances of understanding or intimacy. Even our silences were heavy with meaning, each pause a reminder of the night that had reshaped everything. Outside the house, life continued as normal, oblivious to the undercurrent that defined our home. Inside, we lived in a suspended reality, where every thought, word, and gesture was colored by betrayal, revenge, and the consequences that would never fade. Despite the tension, a quiet clarity emerged. I had become someone capable of surviving extreme circumstances, someone who could navigate fear, manipulation, and emotional complexity without losing composure. The lessons of that night had forged resilience, observation, and vigilance into my very being. Yet, alongside that strength existed a profound loneliness. I had gained power and control, but at the cost of connection, trust, and emotional freedom. I realized that the woman I had become was defined not only by what she could endure, but by what she had lost in the process. The innocence, the naivety, the open-heartedness that had once made life simple and full of warmth. Ethan and I moved through this new reality cautiously, coexisting in a state of constant awareness. Each day was an exercise in balance, each interaction a negotiation of restraint and observation. The consequences of my actions had become permanent fixtures in our lives, shaping our behaviors, emotions, and even thoughts. And yet, the world outside remained blissfully unaware, leaving us trapped in a private ecosystem of tension, where survival and control had replaced trust and love. As time passed, I understood the final truth. Revenge had consequences far beyond the moment of its enactment. It reshaped hearts, minds, and relationships. It created a permanent alteration in those who carried it out and those who suffered its effects. The power I had sought, the justice I had exacted, was inseparable from the cost, the permanent erosion of innocence, the quiet fracture of connection, and the creation of a life defined by vigilance, fear, and awareness. We were no longer the people we had been. We were something else entirely, forged in the fires of betrayal, tempered by the consequences of our actions, and bound together by a shared history that neither of us could escape. And as I sit here now, observing Ethan as he quietly moves about the house, noting every careful step, every subtle gesture, every flicker of emotion, I realize that this is the life we have created, the life I have created. It is a life of control and vigilance, of power and guilt, of survival and consequence. We are two people forever changed, bound by a single night, a single act, and the ripples of that night will extend endlessly into the future. There is no going back. There is only forward, into a reality that we navigate cautiously, endlessly aware of the price of revenge, and eternally shaped by the choices we made when betrayal demanded a reckoning.